to Trekosophy, the podcast dedicated to Star Trek and philosophy. Today we've got Pretty Eyes Benjamin McLean and Chris McGee, who likes to carry eyes around in his pocket. And I'm Brandon Kirby, facilitating the discussion today. So today we're going to talk about enterprise and the intersection between that and philosophy. But before we get there, there's some negative perceptions of enterprise. So I think that might be interesting to draw out first. So there were some criticisms you two had of the show. What were they?
Well, first, I think we might want to clarify when we're saying Enterprise, we're talking about Star Trek Enterprise, the show that occurred in the early 2000s, and not the ship itself, exactly.
Yeah, I'd say, the show that killed Star Trek on television, and just leave it at that.
That's another way of putting it, yes.
Now, why did it kill Star Trek?
Well, that's just a mathematical financial argument there, not even a value. I mean, because just the ratings tanked, if I remember right, and it got canceled.
Yeah, that's pretty much the exact reason. Of course, you could also quote the reasons that fans have, such as, well, the theme music sucked, the fact that it took place before Kirk's time sucked. It should have been a sequel, not a prequel. But yeah, when it comes down to it, it really was ratings, basically.
Well, I'm going to stand up for Enterprise. When it initially aired, I was so disgusted with the show because the first two seasons were awful. I think they were trying to replicate the enchantment of the original series, and they failed miserably at that. And then in the third and fourth season, they moved into doing something that was more what Battlestar Galactica succeeded at. They wanted to do story arcs that had you captivated from episode to episode, and you wanted to find out what was going on next. And in that, I think they succeeded. Season 3 and 4 of Enterprise rivals any Star Trek in terms of captivating.
Okay, well, we actually were talking about the reasons why it failed commercially, and we didn't really cover the reasons why we think it's actually a bad show. So we got.
I got off on a tangent. I meant to say I stopped watching the show between season 1 and 2. I lost interest. And so I think there's a lot of people like me out there who caused the ratings to go down. Even though season 3 and 4 were excellent Trek, I wasn't watching it when it initially aired. In hindsight, I wish I had. But I do think the ratings being low isn't really a reflection on the quality of the last two seasons. That was my point.
Okay. One thing I might say about the theme music, which is kind of a really dumb thing to rate any show on, is the theme music. But I didn't think it was that bad of a theme music, except that it wasn't Star Trek.
It
was
exactly
something
right.
else.
See, what's happening is here, the song in and of itself is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It even fits in with the theme of the show. But the longtime fans are used to a nice orchestral opening with maybe a recognizable theme in it. No words, just completely orchestral. And then suddenly they're hit with this pop song, and they felt a little bit betrayed, I think.
Yeah, it kind of felt sellout-y. But if it hadn't been on Star Trek, if it had been the theme for some other show, people would have judged it by entirely different standards. I think it is fair to judge Enterprise, though, by the standards of previous Star Trek media. I don't think that's unfair at all.
Well, don't
But
forget.
from the network's point of view, I can understand why they were looking at it as just another TV show, and yeah.
Exactly. They kind of were distancing themselves a little bit from the Star Trek brand. For the first two seasons, they didn't even have Star Trek in the title. It was just Enterprise.
Yeah. Let's start talking about why it wasn't that great of a show. The characters okay, it's the actors weren't that bad, but the characters and the writing, especially in the first few seasons, were not very good at all. Now, I like time travel stories. I thought the whole temporal war arc thing was actually pretty cool just because I like time travel stories, even though that sort of thing didn't fit very well on Star Trek. Wasn't the captain guy on Quantum Leap? So with him, I guess you're supposed to expect that kind of thing to happen. Um, Maybe they were trying to reach out to Quantum Leap fans with that. But anyway, the real core of the reason why I don't like Enterprise really comes down to the philosophy of the show, which I thought was almost entirely wrong, um, and not in step with either the other Star Treks, which were wrong only some of the time, while Enterprise is just about always wrong. Not always, always, but I would say normally consistently wrong on philosophy. And the other Star Treks were kind of on and off, hit and miss. Enterprise
Well,
was miss, 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 miss.
well, okay. I think this is the core of what we're getting at here. When you say wrong, what's your criteria for saying right and wrong philosophically?
Well, for one thing, I really cannot stand Dr. Phlox. Now, the actor guy is okay, and I'm not saying that the actor who played Dr. Phlox is a bad actor. He's a fine actor, and I would put him in a movie as the villain. But I don't think Dr. Phlox was a good guy. I think he was a bad guy, especially in Dear Doctor, which I would rank as the worst Star Trek episode of all time. Um, where Phlox, I mean, Phlox has no medical ethics. When he invokes medical ethics, he is on the wrong side.
Okay, well now
And
hold up
it's just
right there
about
for
all
just a second.
okay.
We're judging his ethics by human standards. He's not human.
Exactly, because there are no aliens on Star Trek. At least there are no alien values on Star
Well,
Trek.
maybe they were trying to alter that perception by saying, well, this person has a completely different set of ethics
The
than
trouble
we're
is he
used to.
didn't.
Yeah, but Ben, aren't you begging the question in the sense that Phlox I found to be an extremely relatable character. I know people and socialize with people who would hold his ethics. I don't agree with them, but if I'm going to engage in a discussion with them in something like Trekosophy, like we're doing now, uh, I don't think it's fair to just say a priori he's got the wrong ethics. I think you have to draw that out. I don't think your starting point can be Phlox was wrong. I think you have to clarify what you mean by that.
I've got to justify that, and to do that, we have to go into particular cases because
Mm-hmm.
he
By
doesn't
all
start
means.
out by articulating a philosophy.
Right. So by all means, do that.
Okay, well, first of all, Phlox is the only doctor of the Enterprise from all the Star Trek shows who was prepared to turn the Enterprise sickbay into an abortion clinic for a voluntary, socioeconomically based abortion, which had nothing to do with health and everything to do with social relationships and economics, and and was not to save the life of the mother. Uh, and The only reason he didn't actually go through with the abortion, was because he, quote, hadn't finished studying their physiology yet, unquote. And I have to say, I don't care what planet you're from, that is wrong. And, so that seemed to me to commit the show very much to the pro-abortion cause or pro-choice cause. Though in this case, it does seem to be more pro-abortion, because abortion seemed to be the preferred solution in that episode.
Well, I'm
Now,
going to
there's
go out
one
on a
time.
limb here and say that you are definitely pro-life. And I say
Yes, I
that
am.
simply because I know that you are a Christian person. I'm a Christian person myself. So generally, not always, but generally, Christians are pro-life. Um, and of course, we could debate for years about the whole abortion topic. Um, which is it wrong or is it right to abort a child before they're born? Uh, but we
Yeah.
really we
That's
won't
not
get
the only
anywhere.
thing, though. But I think it's remarkable that Phlox is the only one who comes out vocally on a particular side on the issue. There is one other time when abortion is mentioned in Star Trek, and that is in the Next Generation when some lady, I forget which, is
Troy.
having some kind of alien baby, and Worf, as the ship security officer, suggests the possibility of an abortion because the baby, being alien, of some unknown biological thing, may be a security risk to the ship. And the doctor says, I'm not doing that. And that's the only other time when it was brought up on Star Trek. So this does show, even if you're pro choice, it shows that Phlox is coming from a much more radical, non normative, disruptive view that is very different from the view of other doctors on Star Trek. And of course, that's not the only example. Um, the episode Dear Doctor, which I mentioned as the worst ever, Phlox makes a decision to arbitrarily choose to refuse to help a species that is suffering from a genetic disorder on the grounds that species A is helping species B too much and therefore not allowing species B to meet their full potential. So, in order to stop species A from helping species B, I'm going to not help species A, and even though I have a cure for their genetic disorder that is killing millions of them. And that was a completely political decision. It had nothing to do with it had nothing to do with being a doctor. He said he didn't want to interfere with nature on the grounds that it was a genetic disorder, and somehow genetic disorders, according to his idea of ethics, are somehow different from other disorders. And of course, that's nonsense because the whole point of being a doctor is to interfere with nature.
Well, I see where you're coming from, and I appreciate your perspective. But I would want to add this premise into the discussion. I think it should weigh a little. It's that Dr. Phlox represents a certain mentality, just like Jonathan Archer did, just like T'Pol does. Archer begins as a skeptic, much like Sisko does in Deep Space Nine, and that philosophical viewpoint evolves throughout the show. And I don't know that the writers began with the intention that it would evolve, but he's emblematic of a mindset that's very prevalent even in our culture. And so it provides a forum for discussion about the ethics of what Phlox is doing.
Well, if I think other episodes in other series, like in the Next Generation, for example, when Worf wants to commit suicide, or in DS9 when he wants to kill his brother through the Mokhtar ritual thing, those sorts of things do to provide a forum for discussing the issues of life and death, and that's great and all. But the Dear Doctor episode was very one-sided, and and it basically it basically made that episode the whole foundation for the Prime Directive. That Phlox was right, and that this sort of principle that he's operating on is the whole foundation for the Prime Directive, uh, which seems to me to invalidate most of the Prime Directive arguments made throughout Star Trek, because this has got to be just about one of the worst decisions ever. Um, Phlox has got there's a whole onion of issues with him, even from the first episode, with his bizarre use of
Smile.
animals. His bizarre use of animals in medicine is just, it puts more stress on the patient than I think the healing properties of the animal is probably worth in many cases, because it's just so weird. And I mean, if we were going to face aliens, let's do it when we're healthy, you know?
Sure, absolutely. I Well, think about Paul.
Okay, you want to
And
look at other characters. That's fair enough. I've been talking too much about Dr. Phlox. He has a
well,
lot to do
no,
with why I don't like the show, but other
I get,
characters.
no, I totally understand what you're saying. Uh, Enterprise wasn't even handed enough. There is a plethora of views on abortion in our society, but they really only presented one side in that episode, Chosen Realm, I think it was. I'm not sure. Um, but that being said, I think they are doing a service in representing some viewpoints. With T'Pol, she begins, and I can't remember that this ever changed, is representing the view that, representing scientism. The Vulcan Science Directorate determined that time travel is impossible, and so she's never going to accept that view. No matter how much evidence is presented, she won't accept that view. She's siding with the scientific community's judgment and will have this unbending approach to the way in which she interprets reality. You can have quantum dating telling her she's wrong. You can have her own experience with time travel telling her she's wrong. And she's still going to side with what the Vulcan scientists have told her is true. And I think it was really important to represent that view on the show.
Yeah,
Because that's the way a lot of people think. A lot of people say, look, the scientists have said this is true. We can't entertain any other option. Like, a lot of people will think this way.
that's
And
okay.
it
Yeah,
it
you're right here.
it's circular reasoning, because she says, I mean, what's the foundation for that? The Vulcan Science Directorate has determined that there's no evidence for time travel. And so when she's presented with evidence for time travel, she says, no, it can't be evidence for time travel because the Vulcan Science Directorate has found no evidence for time travel. It's circular reasoning. She sacrifices her logic, the thing that she adores and worships, all because of what the scientific community says. It's intoxicated her to the point of disrupting her judgment, her sound judgment. And so she's adopted this philosophy which has been poisonous to her. But that viewpoint, having been represented on Enterprise, I think does us all a service, because now we can discuss that. We can say, okay, to what extent is this happening in our culture today? Phlox does the same thing. He has his views on, the Prime Directive, abortion, and we can say, well, is this going too far? Is the way he treats animals with his healing, with their medicinal powers, is this what's going on here? We can discuss these sort of things because Enterprise presented them to us.
Well, sure. I mean, you could say that about just about any show, though. I mean, you could say that about Triumph of the Will, Hitler's propaganda movie. I mean, it doesn't really redeem Triumph of the Will, though. Now, I don't want to compare Enterprise too much to Triumph of the Will, but what I'm trying to do is sort of say that just because something provides a forum or information about a viewpoint doesn't necessarily make it a positive thing all the way. Now, I think, yeah, to Paul's skepticism about time travel, I guess I forgot about that or didn't put much stress on that and my overall review of the show, and I think that's a good point there. There are some good points about Enterprise. I actually had a post on that in the Facebook group a little while back, and something else. But I really think that to Paul, the way the show deals with Vulcans, I think isn't that I really somewhat dislike, because it reduced mind melding to homosexuality. Mind melding pretty much was homosexuality, and that's all there is, and there isn't anymore, as they say in the Madeline books. And I
Which
just thought, I felt like, okay, if you want to do an episode about homosexuality or whatever, don't drag the established plot elements into it as a metaphor. We already had enough going on with mind melding before adding this other controversial issue and making mind melding be about it.
I thought that was one of the highlights of the show. There was one point before we move. Well, actually, let's move on. We can stay on Dr. Phlox and talk forever about it, but why don't we move on and talk about mind melding? I thought that was one of the highlights. One of the reasons I really enjoyed Enterprise, and it's the shift that the Vulcans have. They had strayed from the original teachings of their religion, and it became something, well, I don't want to say man-made, but Vulcan-made, where they had these structures of their religious belief with the Vulcan High Command, who had this dogmatic preachiness to them, where they would dismiss T'Pol for irrational reasons. They excommunicated that Vulcan sect who practiced mind melding, and for what? For spurious reasons. And along comes T'Pol, who says, okay, let's face reality, I've contracted an STD. And the Vulcans don't show her compassion. And her point was, okay, this STD was forced on me. I didn't willfully engage in the act. And she says, but that's not the reason why you should show me compassion. You should show me compassion because I have the disease. And I think that's a great message for Christians.
Nobody likes AIDS, okay? Nobody supports AIDS except possibly the Westboro Baptist people. And
okay,
nobody takes them seriously. I just felt like it was cheap and political. I really felt like.
I didn't think it was cheap at all. I think people need that message that, you want to tell jokes about people who have herpes. Well, that's not what Christ would have done. He would have done something quite different. But yet we have Christians who will ostracize, and not just Christians, non-Christians too. Will tell jokes, will demean, will belittle, will show no compassion or grace whatsoever. They'll only pay lip service to it. And for that show to come along and say, no, you don't need an excuse to be compassionate. You can just be compassionate and show people who have contracted something love just because they're suffering. I thought that was a good point. Cheap, yes. Political, yes. I don't deny that, but I still think it's useful.
Yeah, well, we do want to stop AIDS. Obviously, it just seemed like I really wish they could have made up a new alien species, like Next Generation definitely would have if it had wanted to deal with this issue. In fact, I think it did. I think it did on a few occasions actually deal with this issue by inventing new alien races, and I really felt like that would have been the way to go. I don't like how it presented the issue from a storytelling angle.
But that's what I thought was brilliant.
The way it used existing elements and then recontextualized them for what seemed like a much cheaper and more temporary or more, the way it just sort of it seemed to violently interject more sort of I don't know. I'm trying to find the words here for why I think this is bad writing. It's not a bad message. I think it was badly written. Let me put it like that. I think
it was just shoehorned into the history of the Vulcans. Okay, well, see, I can see both of your points here. I can see Ben saying, well, it's kind of a betrayal of everything we already know about Vulcans, that they just kind of threw this in there. Oh, by the way, it used to be, frowned upon that they.
Oh, by the way, mind melding is homosexuality, and there's
I can see
there's
your
also
point of
a
view.
mind melding AIDS, and I'm like,
However, I can also see
That's
Brandon's point of view, and I actually kind of lean toward Brandon because uh, what your alternative bin is that, well, they should just invent the alien of the week, have them have this STD episode with them, and not involve the races we already know. Whereas I
because it
think,
doesn't fit in the narrative.
Oh, I
well,
think it fits perfectly.
I think it actually kind of it brings a little bit more history to Vulcans for one thing, something that we
Yeah.
don't know much about up to this point. And for another thing, it also kind of affects a race that we already know. And wow, oh my goodness, we didn't know this about them. This is interesting. Rather than just introducing the new alien of the week that has this STD problem. I'd rather it be not necessarily shoehorned in, which maybe it was, maybe not. I'm not quite sure on that, but I'd rather it be something else that we've already known established, bring a little more history to that race, rather than just introducing another alien of the week.
Well, I think that's a good point too. But I would want to personalize it a little bit, Crewman McLean. What you have here is a species that's gone astray with their religious values. And throughout the show, there's a reformation where they discover the teachings of their original founder.
Yeah, that
And
was okay, I guess. I
this
mean,
reforms the Vulcans. Now, you yourself, knowing a little bit about your religious background, would consent to the view that Christianity fell into some apostasy at one point. But reformation is possible.
yeah, it's just that well, that's been dealt with other places better in more detail and to greater effect in other Star Trek series already. I mean, with the Bajorans and the Klingons in DS9. Well, really, it's been dealt with all over in DS9, and
Well,
I think some of the races on Voyager also dealt with that. And
if you really want to get down to it, if you look at Star Trek with a detached view, you'll actually kind of see that there's only about maybe 7 or 8 plots that they reuse throughout all the series that they just maybe throw a different spin on it.
why put
Or
Star Trek in it? There's only 7 or 8 plots in the world.
well, yeah, exactly. That's kind of but you see my point. So I mean, yeah, it's going to have been redone in Next Generation. It will be redone several times in DS9 and Voyager. Yeah, that's just kind of the way it is. That's the entertainment world. You got to tell a story.
But if I wanted to tell one of my friends who has herpes or AIDS or whatever that I love them, and I wanted to watch an episode of Star Trek with them, I wouldn't do it because of the obvious overtones. But could I think of a better episode in Star Trek that I would want to show them other than Stigma from Enterprise? To
Yeah.
say, you know what, there is legitimate bigotry that you face, but the truth is, I love you. I can't think of any other episode in the whole Star Trek franchise other than Stigma that would get the job done. I wouldn't do it because it would be so obvious, but that being said, I would want them to randomly pick that episode to watch.
Well, hey, wait a minute. What about the one where Doctor Bashir is fighting the plague on
I was just thinking
the
about that.
Dominion world? That would probably be a good one there
Quickening.
for a disease.
Well, that
victim.
wasn't an STD, though. That was just a genetic disease that the Dominion inflicted on him.
Yeah, I guess I don't like it when things get over sexualized generally, which is why I probably wouldn't like T'Pol in general. I guess I'm inconsistent because I do like 7 of 9, but she does have some things other than her looks that she eventually brings to the table.
Here we have a legitimate disagreement. And I often find myself bringing up this point because everyone who objects to Enterprise invariably, no matter what, will bring up
exactly.
the sexualization of T'Pol.
Especially in that very first pilot episode.
The very first pilot episode.
Yeah, she's almost like an
Now,
object more than a character.
I thought she was a brilliant character, my favorite character. Even if she looked like a sack of crap, she would still be my favorite character. And the reason why I object to that is because if you go back to the original series, it's all about miniskirts. It's all about absurd camera angles.
Mhm.
Star Trek was built on this impulse, the sexual impulse.
Well, we make fun of it in the original series too, though, so at least we're consistent.
Well, that's true, but I don't think they're deviating from the core of Star Trek when they do that.
Probably not, but it
It's
doesn't
part
make
of
it
what's
okay.
well. Now that's debatable.
Okay. Well, anyway.
It was less done in Next Generation, though it was to some extent, and it less done in Deep Space Nine. But you know, you have your
Well,
Dial Girl
Kira
moments
had,
too.
yeah.
Yeah, absurd camera angles in Deep Space Nine, but especially in the original series. So I don't think Enterprise was being un-Star Trekian. Were they being unartistic when they did that? Well, I think that's a separate debate entirely. But I don't think they were being un-Star Trekian when
They
they
were
did
being
that.
very I really thought that they were. I mean, what years was Enterprise going on?
2001 to 2004, I believe.
Oh.
Yeah,
Or
something.
2005. I think it ended in spring of 2005.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I just was kind of amazed by how elfin rather than Vulcan, that T'Pol actually, her makeup job actually looked. I mean, she didn't. She looked like she didn't look like a female Vulcan. She looked like a World of Warcraft avatar.
Point taken.
They hadn't even
Okay.
invented World of Warcraft at that time, too. I think especially that what was it, the decontamination scene in the pilot, that was, I'll admit,
Brilliant.
that was the scene that kind of made me say, really, they're going to do this to the series.
Or just
Thankfully,
they're gonna do it
they
in the
didn't really do it
pilot
that.
episode.
Yeah, well, they did it like once or twice more, I think, but it wasn't nearly
Yeah.
as focused on it and as
We
much
did
as
have the
that
green
pilot.
lady in the cage. I mean, this kind of
Right,
thing
right.
has been Star Trek from the
That's
very
true.
beginning.
But
It's
at the
just that
time, I
we've made
thought it
fun
was
of it
just
all along.
at the time I thought it was just fan service, and I thought this is crap. So I didn't really watch it when it was on the air because of that reason. I hate to admit it, but that's. But
Well,
you're
I didn't
right,
watch it when I was
exactly.
on the air.
The original series was they had the Orion slave girl. That's true. In fact, if you watch the original series, there are several episodes where you see a woman wearing something that clearly would have fallen off if she took a small jump or something, you know. So
Well, I try because my wife is a Trekker, and I had dated.
Wait. That would be Trekkie. A Trekker is someone who makes Star Trek.
uh,
Now, this
Trekkie is someone who uses it.
okay. For the sake
Watched
of
it.
your happiness, I'll say Trek.
okay.
Because my wife is a Trekkie, as you prefer. She I dated some women prior to her who would say, "Oh yeah, I really dig Star Trek. I really like that guy with the thing around his eyes." I'm like, "Shut up, you're single now." But with Rachel, my wife, we were watching an episode of Next Generation, and she quoted along with it. It was a quote, "Miles Edward O'Brien, I am still your wife." That was the first quote I heard her say to speak along with the show. And I was like, "You really like Star Trek," but she doesn't like the original series. And I tried watching a few episodes with her, and she had objected so much with the ridiculous camera angles, like with a camera on the floor and a woman walking over it. It's just absurd what they had done. So in Enterprise, in doing that, I thought they were in keeping with the original spirit.
All right. What's next?
Okay, well, let's see.
Oh, there's more questions.
Okay.
What about Archer and a seemingly relativistic mindset about ethics? He's in the what's it called? The Expanse, and his ship is preyed upon, and he comes across some thieves. And then later on in season 3, while they're deep into the Expanse, what happens? There's a ship that has some components. I can't remember which components they were specifically.
But he has to steal just like they did in order to win.
He has to steal just like they did in order to win. So it seems to me as if the show is promoting some sort of relativistic mindset with respect to ethics.
I
Well,
certainly think it is, but I don't see how what you just said shows that it is. I mean, you could come away with that with just the simple impression that Archer is a total hypocrite, realizes it, and somewhat regrets it, and then okay, that happened. Now let's move on. I mean, I don't really see where you're getting a general theory of ethics out of that.
well, let me ask you this real quickly. Archer stole the pieces in season 3, the whatever parts he needed for the ship, in order to survive. Was that not correct?
Yeah, but
Well,
the thieves back in the
What?
early ones said it was for survival too, didn't they?
Oh, okay. I couldn't
I
remember. It's
don't
been
think
a
it
while
was
since I've
just
seen it.
I don't think it was just survival. As I recall the episode, and I'm really having to draw on my memory bank here, and that's risky stuff. As I recall, he was saying it was for the success of his mission, which was to save Earth. So it was greater than just his survival; it was also the
Okay.
survival of the race.
But we don't
Yeah,
know about it. The other ship in the earlier season, we don't know exactly. They claimed it was just for survival, but was it just for the survival of their ship and their crew?
I don't know. I just don't see as how this shows he's got a relativistic mindset about ethics. Now, I think his
Well,
being
it's
willing to put up with Dr. Flock shows he's got a relativistic mindset about ethics, and I'm not particularly fond of the relativistic ethics that run throughout much of Star Trek. But I don't see how this particular example shows it. So how
I'm
does it?
doubly fond of the relativistic ethics that happens throughout Star Trek. I think it shows it because it's not the sort of thing that he would have done if he were outside of the expanse. And so it shows that there's something situational. Okay, in this particular context, one ethical judgment will be correct. And if you divorce it from the context, it's all of a sudden incorrect. And when I read
Yeah.
Kant, when I read all of the great absolutists when it comes to ethics, none of them would consent to that judgment.
Hold
They will
on.
all go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, you said you'd read Peter Kraft in a previous episode, right?
Oh, I love Peter Kraft.
Yeah, well, he says there's three factors that go. Well, he is an absolutist, and he says there are three factors that go into the consideration of a moral judgment, and that is the nature of the act itself, the circumstances, and the motivation. And just showing that the circumstances are a factor is not quite the same thing as relativism and ethics. In fact, relativism is more of a meta-ethical theory than an ethical one.
Well, if you boil it down to so many variables, I don't see what the difference is between a relativist and an absolutist. I mean, for Kant, the context is irrelevant for the action.
Yeah, well, it's the distinction between it's yeah. Well, you have to make the distinction between ethics and meta-ethics. Ethics is the question of what is
Absolutely.
right and wrong, while meta-ethics is the question of um, what do we mean by saying that it is right or that it is wrong.
Sure, yeah. I
Okay,
mean, I really like
and
the way you put that.
in relativism, aka ethical subjectivism, means relativism, ethical subjectivism means that the answers to moral questions vary depending on basically who you are. That they will be different for, you know, they will be different in an arbitrary fashion. While an absolutist in the meta-ethical sense, or a objectivist in the strictly meta-ethical sense, not Ayn Rand objectivism, but meta-ethical objectivism, the answers to moral questions will always come out the same no matter what the factors are. For example, if we have two acts with the same motivation, the same nature of the act itself, and the and equivalent circumstances, then the answer will always come out the same no matter who you are. So absolutism in the metaethical sense does not always mean deontological like in Kant.
Right.
Okay, now I can see how so situational and relativist are not the same thing. Okay, and so I can see how Archer's decisions to, on the one hand, prosecute the one thief, and then on the other hand, become a thief himself when everything depends on it. I can see how that is a highly situational set of ethical decisions, but I don't see as how it gets us to relativism and metaethics.
I think if I were to analyze, if I were to ask you to write a 15-page paper on the subject, and I were to do the same, and I've read some of your posts, I don't think that's beyond the realm of possibility.
Yeah, except I wouldn't want to base it on Enterprise. I don't like Enterprise enough to do that. I'd probably draw an example from someplace else.
Okay, fair enough. I think what we're saying is something very similar. I mean, my view is that Archer's ethics are relativistic insofar as they are relative to the situation at hand.
Oh, okay.
And I don't think that's a far cry from what you're saying. I think what we're saying is just a difference in terminology or language rather than in the substance of our thoughts.
Okay, probably. I think sometimes in Star Trek we do get subjectivism in metaethics, and that is what I was saying earlier that I really I really don't like. Being a C.S. Lewis fan, and Lewis spending a good deal of his time saying that subjectivism is poison.
Well, look, if I could marry C.S. Lewis, I would, but I don't think he'd be up for it. Well, given that he's dead would be a good reason not to, but even still, I'd marry him. He,
How?
I find him extremely provocative.
Yeah.
But on the subject of relativism, I do think Christians have to adopt some semblance of relativism. Not just situational ethics, but even relativism. Now, Archer's going to say, if I'm to pretend I'm Jonathan Archer, I would try to defend my actions and say, okay, my ethics are relative to the greater good. The greater good is served by me fighting off thieves in this instance, but being a thief in this instance.
In other words, utilitarianism.
Well, not quite utilitarianism, because he could argue that he has some sort of special duty to Earth.
Well, wait. How is that not utilitarianism? He's for the utility of Earth people, but it's still utilitarianism. He's just set the greatest good of the greatest number of Earth people.
Okay, well, I mean, if he were a strict utilitarianism, he could recognize that there's 83 people on Enterprise and that there's 27 people on this other ship. He should prey on the other ship just for the sake of his own ship's well-being. If you're a strict utilitarian, he would accept that judgment.
Okay, so maybe he's a rule-based utilitarian then.
Well, I'm just saying that if he weren't in the expanse, he probably wouldn't accept that line of reasoning. So I don't know that he's a utilitarian. Maybe he is. I'm just saying I don't think he would accept that line.
I wasn't saying he was. I said it sounded like that's what you were making him out to be from what you just said.
No, what I was getting at, though, was the greater good. He will perform some sort of action and call it ethical if it's relative to the greater good. Now, as Christians, we have to recognize that the laws that were followed in the Old Covenant are not the laws that we follow now. And so there's some sort of relativism in that our ethical beliefs are relative to God, which is the greatest good.
Well, hold on, though.
Go for it.
Well, if you want to turn this into a theological argument, I wasn't going to bring theology into it, but if you want to bring theology into it, then I would say that the difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant is relative to time. I don't believe that God changed between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. What changed was our temporal perspective.
But there's a whole different set of laws that are necessary for us to follow.
Right, because the old laws look forward and the new laws look backward.
Sure.
And if we were transported somehow back in time to the old times, then we'd be under the old law. So it's really relative to time.
I don't know, because given the way I think, I mean, to all of a sudden become somebody who's warlike, that would be difficult for me. I mean, I'm not a particularly belligerent person. I mean, they practiced polygamy, whereas most Christians now will denounce the practice.
Well, as I'm RLDS, I think polygamy was always wrong.
Okay.
Well,
they practiced it. And when you look at, I mean, God, I think he even commanded it in certain points in Genesis.
I do not agree with that at all, and I'd have to see your reference.
Wasn't Abraham commanded to take some other mate?
No. Abraham was commanded to bear children, and he took on a concubine to try to bear children and had Ishmael, but Ishmael was not accepted by God. Only when he undertook having a child with his one and only wife was he able to have Isaac, who became the father of Jacob and thus the father of Israel.
I have to look up the passage to be more specific, unfortunately. But I think we could agree that
there are a number of things in the Old Testament law that I'm sure we would find very difficult. I will concede that point.
Okay. Well, that's all I was trying to get at.
Sure.
So I think as Christians, you have to accept some degree of relativism.
Well, I don't think so, because, like I said, the factors change. You know, the judgment changed because the factors changed.
Exactly.
But
exactly, that's the whole point. I mean, the absolute
but that does
judgment
not mean
fails.
that the answers to moral questions will be different arbitrarily. It's not an arbitrary. It's not an arbitrary subjective difference. Okay, for instance, it doesn't matter who you are traveling back in time to the Old Testament period. You would still be under the Old Testament law if you were transported back in time.
Right.
And for instance, someone like the existentialists, for example, would say that just scratch that. I don't think that's the same thing as relativism, because it's not a meta-ethical distinction. The Old Testament law, the New Testament law, they are both absolute in terms of meta-ethics, and then they differ on ethics.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
I mean,
it's relative to God, but
they are situational, but that's an ethical difference, not a meta-ethical one.
Oh, I totally agree. But you're going to come up with opposite ethical judgments.
I don't think so, because
you're not going to come up with opposite.
You change the problem, you change the input, then you change the output. In subjectivism, given the same input, you could get different answers, but with an absolute ethics or an objective ethics, with the same input, you should always get the same output. And in the case you brought up, there's different input.
I don't know that we have the same linguistic terminology. I agree with you that if someone were to live my life, they should come up with the exact same ethical. I shouldn't say they should come up with the same ones as me. I'm sure I faltered in my ethical judgments. Not just my ethical actions, but my ethical judgments at some point.
You believe there are right answers to moral questions and wrong answers to moral questions?
Not all moral questions, no.
It seems to me that if there is no right or wrong answer, then it's not really a moral question.
I'm not sure I agree.
Okay, well, yeah, if you could give a counterexample, that'd be good.
Sure, yeah. Well, consider the issue of modesty, for example. Now, what constitutes modest apparel? Okay, so the counterexample is modesty. What constitutes modest apparel is going to differ greatly if you're in the south of France as compared to the Vatican, or if you're in Hawaii as compared to an Egyptian mosque.
Yeah.
Now let's transpose this debate of modesty. What is modesty into our culture, which is a bit more of a hodgepodge? Can I say what constitutes modesty for all in our culture? No, I don't think that I can. Now, somebody could live in my culture and they could have a very different judgment than I do. And it is a moral question. I mean, what I'm going to wear is a moral question for me. But I don't think that I can give a prescriptive, definitive answer for everyone.
Well, hold on. Yeah, C.S. Lewis addresses this exact issue in Mere Christianity, Chapter 5, Sexual Morality. And I think I could quote from that because I got the text of it up.
By all means.
Okay, well, he says, the Christian rule of chastity must not be confused with the social rule of modesty, in one sense of that word, i.e., propriety or decency. The social rule of propriety lays down how much of the human body should be displayed, and what subjects can be referred to, in what words, according to the customs of a given social circle. Thus, while the rule of chastity is the same for all Christians at all times, the rule of propriety changes. A girl in the Pacific Islands wearing hardly any clothes and a Victorian lady completely covered in clothes might be both equally modest, proper, or decent, according to the standards of their own societies, and both, for all we could tell by their dress, might be equally chaste or equally unchaste. Some of the language which chaste women used in Shakespeare's time would have been used in the 19th century only by a woman completely abandoned. When people break the rule of propriety current in their own time and place, if they do so in order to excite lust in themselves or others, then they are offending against chastity. But if they break it through ignorance or carelessness, they are guilty only of bad manners. When, as often happens, they break it defiantly in order to shock or embarrass others, they are not necessarily being unchaste, but they are being uncharitable, for it is uncharitable to take pleasure in making other people uncomfortable. I do not think that a very strict or fussy standard of propriety is any proof of chastity or any help to it, and I therefore regard the great relaxation and simplifying of the rule which has taken place in my own lifetime as a good thing. At its present stage, however, it has this inconvenience, that people of different ages and different types do not all acknowledge the same standard, and we hardly know where we are. While this confusion lasts, I think that old or old-fashioned people should be very careful not to assume that young or emancipated people are corrupt whenever they are, by the old standard, improper, and in return that young people should not call their elders prudes or Puritans because they do not easily adopt the new standard. A real desire to believe all the good you can of others and make others as comfortable as possible, as comfortable as you can, will solve most of the problems. Now, it's important to understand that this paragraph that I just read was written in the late 40s, early 50s, and this was before the 1960s.
Early 40s.
What?
It was early 40s.
Oh yes, early 40s. So this Lewis was not commenting on the 1960s. I think that's very important to recognize that.
Well, it sounds like it could still be relevant today.
It's absolutely relevant today.
I think it is relevant today, but it does not mean quite the same thing. After the sexual revolution, which really was a revolution, it's somewhat out of context if you try to flatly apply it to post 1960s, when we've gone beyond we've gone beyond a sort of difference in dress to a difference in the fundamental goals of our life.
So you mean to say Lewis's text is relative to the time period in which it is written?
I think taking anything out of its historical context is bad interpretation.
Okay, now we're making some progress.
Now, I hoped that this would try to help drive the discussion along. If you're going to go with the example of modesty to try to show a sort of Christian relativism, you could argue that he is going for a more relativistic view here, except for the fact that Lewis himself is one of the foremost defenders of of an absolutist objective type ethics as opposed to subjectivist type ethics. And so if he can say something like that, then I think we've somewhat got our definitions crossed if we try to say that an absolutist system in metaethics cannot admit any consideration of situation, circumstances, or context. I think the word deontological would probably be a better word for context-free ethics.
Sure. Let's consent that Lewis was right when he talks about there's some code of fair play
But
that
here's the
all
thing.
humans consent to.
Here's the thing. There's no. The reason this isn't relativistic in the meta-ethical sense is because two ladies in Victorian society and two ladies in Hawaiian society would be pretty much having the same rules given they're in the same context.
Oh, that's not true.
Well, according to what Lewis just said. Now you may disagree with Lewis, but I think that's what Lewis is saying here.
Well, maybe it's true that he would have said it, but he would have been wrong to say it.
Okay, yeah. So why is that? You can go on. Yeah.
And Lewis didn't even say that. Lewis made the point how there are, even within one culture, various gaps generationally, and I would argue economically, in the Victorian period. If you were of an upper class, a certain degree of modesty is required to you. If you were in the lower class, less modesty is required of you in order for you to say that you are modest.
I think the way I just said that was definitely not correct. Now that you're bringing this up, I think the words I used did not match the thought I had. So let me just withdraw that statement.
Well, withdraw it and refine it for us.
Okay. Let me put it like this. I think what Lewis is saying is that modesty is only a moral issue as it relates to offending against chastity. And that the rule of chastity is universal, while the rule of modesty is a set of different constructed agreements that we've constructed as a sort of social contract to try as a help toward the virtue of chastity. Just like there are no natural intellectual property rights, but that intellectual property rights are based on a social contract.
Okay.
I guess using an example from one thing I believe for another thing I believe, you might disagree with both, so then I'd be in trouble. But yeah.
I'm actually inclined to disagree with both, but I'll leave it at that. I agree with you, and I think it comes back to our original discussion of enterprise, and it's that the ethical judgments can be relative, but they're relative to some sort of absolute standard.
There you go.
And I don't even think, if you're to look at the champion of relativistic morality, Nietzsche. Who's going to deny that it's Nietzsche? No.
Definitely Nietzsche.
Definitely Nietzsche. even Nietzsche's going to have in mind some sort of a standard. I mean, he says man is a thing to be surpassed. Chesterton says, okay, but what's the criteria whereby man surpasses man? That's the thing that we'll strive for, this absolutism. But even Nietzsche has in mind the standard whereby one person is better than another. So even in relativism, it's relative to something. And that's my point. Enterprise fleshes out for us that, yes, the patriarchs followed a different morality than we do, and you and I might disagree about their sexual liberty and whether or not concubines are pious in the Old Covenant. But there remains the point that their ethics are relative to something, i.e. God. For Nietzsche, that something is different, but nevertheless, it's relative to something. And so when I watch Enterprise, I see, okay, they have different ethical judgments, but their ethical judgments aren't a total liberty. Archer can only do something insofar as it helps him accomplish his mission, which is to save Earth. It's not a total free-for-all. There's still a constraint on what he's permitted to do.
I'm not sure I agree with your statement that ethics are relative to God, because that would put you on the side of Euthyphro in the Euthyphro dilemma.
Well, you're welcome to tag me with that sort of label. I'll defend it if you like.
You want to defend Euthyphro?
I want to defend the concept that goodness is not independent of God.
Okay. As a Latter-day Saint, I would defend the idea that all truth is independent in that sphere in which God has placed it. That comes out of the Latter-day Saint Doctrine and Covenants. So we got a fairly major, fairly fundamental theological difference here.
You are correct. That
do you
is
want
a significant
to
difference.
attack that now, or should we?
Well, it might veer us off course from discussing Enterprise.
Yeah, probably.
But that actually does sound like a very fascinating thing to investigate.
We can definitely add that to our list of things to discuss. One thing that I do want to mention about Enterprise, though, is that it is quite often panned about how bad it is. As Brandon has pointed out, however, it really started hitting its stride in the third and fourth seasons. Well, so did every other, except for the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager.
I liked early DS9.
Well, you're the exception to the rule. But the first
I liked early Next Generation, but I agree with you, Chris.
The first couple of seasons are generally...
You can't agree with everybody all the time, Brandon.
Exactly. Are generally looked on as not that good. That it takes a couple of seasons for each of those shows to really hit their stride. I think Enterprise was no exception to that. And in fact, once they hit the third season where they had the long arc in the Expanse, they hit upon something that was actually good, because DS9 showed us that it's really good to have, threads that continue on in a long story arc for characters and for the main plot.
Absolutely.
And the fourth season itself gave us some really, really good episodes. I will kind of forget about the first episode or two of the fourth season, which were kind of silly, I thought, but the rest of it was really, they started hitting some really good episodes there, including the eugenics one.
Okay, I have another thing I want to bring up about Enterprise.
Oh, no, you bring up that other point, and then I'll bring up my closing.
Because this isn't something to close on too much, but there's a couple good things about Enterprise or at least one good thing about Enterprise that we haven't discussed, and that is the episode with the Orion slaves in it.
That was my favorite episode.
And I have to say, that has to be one of the strongest episodes on Enterprise. And it illustrates Hegel's master-slave dialectic.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah, the slaves don't need the masters, but the masters need the slaves. So it's really the masters who are the real slaves and the slaves who are the real masters if only they realize it.
Well, I mean, even beyond that, I think feminism as a philosophy, though we all, I'm sure, have our own private thoughts about it, boils down to a power relation between the marginalized and those who are not marginalized. And it's about shifting those power relations into something that is more of an equality relation. Well, that episode, I think, highlighted the fact that power relations can shift very easily. It really doesn't take a great deal of effort to shift those power relations. And I think that speaks something expertly to Marx, to race philosophers, to feminist philosophers. I think a great deal of people who experiment with power relations need to watch that episode. It's brilliant.
Yeah, one of the things it shows, I do not mean to lift up the Orions at all, but it shows that women have always had a position of great power.
Absolutely.
It's not been explicitly political power, but they've always kind of been the power behind the throne. Kraft, he's a Catholic, and this is a very Catholic story. And I'm not Catholic, and I don't believe in Mary being the mother of God. But it's a great story that illustrates this relationship between men and women. And that is children were playing at pirates. A little boy and a little girl. The little boy says, "Oh, I want to be the captain." And he insists on being the captain. And so finally, the little girl, she wanted to be the captain, but he won't let her. So finally, the little girl says, "Okay, but I'm the captain's mother."
Okay. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I have nothing but enormous respect for Kraft, and it was just elevated twofold because you told that story. I mean, that was great. All right, well, then, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Trekosophy, where we investigate the intersection of Star Trek and philosophy. You've had Benjamin McLean starring in Two Klingons, One Blood Wine Chalice.
What?
And Chris McGee, also starring in the same movie, starring as the Chalice, bringing you Trekosophy, where we investigate the intersection of philosophy and Star Trek. I'm Brandon Kirby. Thank you very much for joining us. What's that internet law called where if you mention the Nazis, you're an idiot? What's
That's not how the law. It's Godwin's law, and it says that
Godwin's law? If you mention the Nazis in a Star Trek episode, you suck.
No, that's not it. It's any internet conversation of sufficient length will contain at least one reference to Hitler or the Nazis, and it's not making a judgment. It's just stating a fact. If you want to say anyone who trips Godwin's law is an idiot, that's your business, not Godwin's.
Well, that's my business. That's any Star Trek series which goes of sufficient length will mention the Nazis.
I don't see what's wrong with that.
Shoot.
The Nazis were evil. It's a very basic, primal kind of evil we can all agree on in the modern world.
But so were the
it
Spartans.
makes some great stories. I mean, I love those Indiana Jones movies where he's dodging Nazis. That was awesome.
I haven't seen one Indiana Jones movie yet.
What the
Okay,
heck?
we need to kick him out of the podcast now.
Seriously, get them on Netflix like as soon as okay, leave the show and start with
You are ordered by Commander McLean.
yes. Well, did I steal your thunder of what you were going to say as your closing remark, though? I hope I didn't.
Oh, what I said sucked comparatively.
Sorry. I don't like Enterprise generally, and I don't think that really redeemed Enterprise from my point of view.
But speaking about the that Orion slave girl, real quick, I just wanted to interject. It's still amazing to me to know that the actress who played the lead Orion slave girl in that Enterprise episode Bound, she was actually also the same actress who played Tora Ziyal in Deep Space Nine, the first true times that we met her, when she was like a teenager then.
Wow.
Really? Wow, did not know that.
Yeah.
He's the Vulcan, Buddha, Socrates, and Jesus all rolled into one. Well, you've really got to define your term. What's dogmatism mean?
Crap.
Sorry.
I thought you were going to ask a miserable question like that.
Believe this or burn. Right, yeah, like you shouldn't suggest at the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that we hold the next meeting in a bar during happy hour. Yeah, we might want to have an episode on Ducat and the moral event horizon.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think, don't we have that in there? Or do we have
I
an
thought
episode
so,
of
but
the
I
nature
don't
of
see
evil?
it on here.
Oh, well, add Ducat, the Borg, and the nature of evil.
Oh, we got the Borg in here, yeah.
Well, maybe now, let's not bring the Borg into the nature of evil. I mean, they're relevant, but they need their own episode.
Yeah, they're not exactly evil.
Does Ducat have his own episode?
Oh, Ducat deserves his own episode.
Oh, absolutely, he does.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely needs his own episode.
We've already done a Garrick episode. We might as well have one on.
Wayoon needs his own episode, don't you think?
Wow.